The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Brian Wansink is a researcher at Cornell's Food and Drug Lab, and he's been a guest on this program, and he does a lot of research into the psychology of food and eating. And there's a new study which shows that if you have people who are more overweight around you, regardless of how much they eat that day, you are more likely to consume more food. The researchers recruited 82 undergraduate college students to eat a spaghetti and salad lunch, okay? They also enlisted an actress to wear a prosthesis that added 50 pounds to what is her normal weight. She has an average weight. Each of the 82 participants was randomly assigned to one of four scenarios. The actress serves herself healthfully while wearing the fat suit, so to speak. She serves herself healthily while not wearing the prosthesis. She serves herself less healthfully, meaning a ton of pasta and little or no salad, while wearing the prosthesis. And then she serves herself less healthfully while not wearing the prosthesis. And participants viewed what she was doing and then served themselves pasta and salad. And what they found was that when the actress wore the prosthesis and appeared to be overweight, regardless of whether she served herself more pasta or more salad, the students who were eating near her would eat more, right? So what seemed to matter was not what her eating habits were that day, whether she had more or less salad or more or less pasta or her portion sizes, but rather just the fact that there was a significantly overweight person eating around them at all seemed to influence the decisions about portion size and how much salad versus pasta. What do you think, Lewis?
I don't really know how to explain that. Did they at all try to figure out why this was happening, or did they just note that this was what was happening?
Well, it says, what they wrote is, the findings emphasize the importance of pre-committing to meal choices before entering a restaurant. If you go into a restaurant knowing what you're going to order, you're much less likely to be negatively influenced by the things around you that might get you to eat more. So I think that the consensus would be, if people at your own table eat more, that may influence you to eat more. But when it comes to other diners, what specifically they eat is not as important. But if there are more overweight diners, that seems to influence the diners to consume more food. The explanation is not made explicit by the study. It's a relatively small study, so we definitely need to look into this further. Anecdotally, I talked to a couple people about this, and they said, when I go to eat and there are overweight people, I eat less because it reminds me I shouldn't be overeating because I don't want to put on more weight than I'd like to. So I think we definitely need to research this more, but I find the work that they do at the Cornell Food and Drug Lab really interesting.
Yeah, they do many, many interesting studies, and we should probably try and get Brian back on the show.
For a long, long time, we've seen space exploration-based science fiction explore the possibilities, the logistics of how we would go somewhere that's really far from Earth. And one of the ideas has been something kind of around the idea of either some kind of hibernation state or a deep sleep or a suspended animation. And now there's a NASA-backed study that's actually exploring something along these lines, putting the crew in a sort of stasis for a deep sleep called torpor. And it would reduce the metabolic function of astronauts so that they would be able to go on a very, very long trip, including the many months that it would take based on current technologies to get to Mars. It would reduce the amount of supplies that need to be brought on board, which is a really good thing because it's very expensive in terms of fuel. And the less stuff you have on board, the less the fuel cost is. And it would also reduce, hopefully, some of the psychological effects of being confined to such a small space for such a long trip. So torpor is something that has been around in theory since the 1980s and in reality since 2003. And it's typically used for trauma patients. You put them into this state in order to allow doctors to work on them or to reduce pain while the body heals. And now this is being considered for the trip, to Mars. This is, Lewis, yet again another example of very old sci-fi ideas becoming maybe a reality.
A lot of these old sci-fi ideas in shows and movies were based on actual theory. And yeah, I mean, if those are your ideas, that's what you have to work with until there are new and even more radical ideas. And we are seeing, development now of what used to be called a warp drive. Maybe they're still calling that. People are working on that. The deep sleep, the hibernation type thing, embryonic, you're not embryonic, but a cryogenic rather, freezing of people. These are things that are becoming a reality, and it's pretty amazing.
This torpor state would be coupled with intravenous feeding, so the crew could be put into basically hibernation for the one-way trip to Mars. It would reduce the baseline mission requirements from 400 tons to about 220 tons. The other idea was to do these torpor states in periods of 14 days on a kind of staggered basis, because the requirements and the complexity of doing a 14-day stasis rather than close to 6 months are drastically less significant. So it would be much simpler, and you could have crews kind of overlapping. It would, of course, increase the amount of supplies that were needed, and it would change the dynamics a little bit. But this is so interesting, Lewis, and this is the type of thing that all countries should really be working together on. Who knows also what medical developments could come from this type of research?
That's true. If we had worldwide cooperation on this, I'm sure we would have results very quickly. I just wonder how they would deal with muscle atrophy here, or maybe that has already been addressed, and we just aren't reading about it here.
Good question. I did not read about it in this article, and I don't know that has been addressed. Let's talk a little bit about the upcoming midterm election. We're now less than a month away. I haven't really said too much in general about this upcoming election, and I've talked so much about the sad state of affairs that we're in this country in terms of elections and the connection between the desires of voters and the elected officials actually expressing or acting on the desires of their constituents. And I realize that it takes much more than one election to upend the government. But if you look at the 2014 election, there is a huge opportunity to very drastically change our political system. I mean, think about it. 435 members of Congress up for re-election. They could all be replaced. Just bear with me for now. 33 out of the 100 senators that could be replaced. 36 states are electing new governors. Do you realize that the candidates are out there to put progressives into office in place of plutocratic Democrats or straight up right-wing nuts? But we aren't going to do that, and it just never happens. Midterm elections, number one, rarely have huge turnouts. We see the power of incumbency, and we see the political system, which rewards having money and it rewards incumbency, lead to many, many incumbents, and particularly incumbents who have raised more money, they typically win. We could actually significantly upend the status quo of government with this election, but it's not even discussed in those terms because it becomes an issue, Lewis, of individual races and the incumbent having the money and pushing upstream and seeing if you can eke out a few more percentage points in the latest poll. And if we were to all step back and say, hey, you know what? Progressive ideas are actually pretty popular in this country. When they're couched as socialist, people turn away. But progressive ideas are actually pretty popular. If broadly we all realize the impact we could have, if we all went out and voted in the progressive candidates, we could completely turn around government. But of course, it never happens because it is just such a monumental task. And when you look at the micro, Mitch McConnell's got a lot of money. Maybe Allison Grimes can eke him out, but maybe not. And would she even really be that progressive? That's what it becomes. And it's really a pretty sad state of affairs.
And that race right there is really an exception to the rule.
Yeah.
Because if you are a progressive, you really either have to have that corporate backing, which you probably won't if you're a progressive, or be someone who's already rich or someone who's famous, like Al Franken. And it just, you don't see it. It just doesn't happen.
I want to remind our audience, though, not voting in protest is not a neutral act. There is one party that doesn't want you to vote. There's one party that knows if turnout is low, their ideas and their candidates do better, and that's the Republican Party. The higher voter turnout is, the more progressive the election results are. So for those who are saying, you're right, David, the system is just horrible and I'm not going to vote, you're not neutrally not voting. You're helping one particular party, and people cannot forget that, Lewis.
That is true. There are certainly areas where your vote is going to count a lot more, especially in Kentucky right now, for example. There are places where, the person you want, the progressive, the Democrat will win regardless. But Kentucky, if you have to vote in that race, make sure you do.
We have a great show planned for you today. It's the Friday show on Thursday.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is made possible in part by liberalbias.com. Did you know that study after study after study has shown that increasing taxes on the rich does not kill jobs? Isn't that weird? Obviously, the only possible conclusion is that the word study itself is liberally biased. Find out more at liberalbias.com. Today's new member of the day is Andre Rice. Andre, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. Because of members like Andre, the program has expanded from every other week to every week to twice a week to 4 times a week and now to 5 shows per week. And we are continuing to depend on our members to fund what we are doing. So go to davidpakman.com/membership. Become a member. Very easy. A lot of great member benefits. This week in show history, 3 years ago this week, it's amazing to me that it has already been 3 years. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, passed away at the age of 56. At the time, we talked about Apple's legacy. We talked about Steve Jobs' legacy. And we couldn't avoid also talking about the labor issues surrounding Apple, including the coverage from some of Foxconn, this big factory overseas in China that creates and manufactures a lot of Apple products. And it kind of, for a lot of people, Lewis, was the first glimpse into how these products were made, where they came from, and some of the working conditions.
And it was a real eye-opener, wasn't it? I mean, I knew things were bad over there, but this was an eye-opener for me as well, especially when you hear about how many of their employees were committing suicide on what seemed like a regular basis. And
it doesn't really seem that the coverage of those factories changed much of anything. Apple is still huge, in spite of the fact that their iPhones seem to be playing catch-up with Samsung devices. And we now have, 3 years down the line, we have the iPhone 6 and the iPhone 6 Plus. I wonder, as expensive as those devices are, would Americans be willing to pay more to know that those devices were being produced in conditions that were not guilt-inducing? I wonder if Americans would be willing to pay even more for their Apple or other devices. This is not just an Apple issue.
It's hard to say. I think the cost would be significantly more. And you know what? I think that would annoy Americans. I think it's easier just to ignore what's happening overseas.
Would Americans be more okay? Well, let me take a step back. Most Americans already don't know or care about the tax breaks and loopholes that these big companies get, often reducing their tax liability to effectively zero. I wonder if we would be more okay, those of us who are enraged by that, with companies getting these tax breaks and loopholes and deductions if they were producing their electronics in ways that were more sustainable and moral. I know it would certainly make at least somewhat of a difference for me, although I still wouldn't think that they deserve to pay no taxes.
That would be nice. I mean, if you consider how many jobs this country could have if outsourcing were not an issue, we're talking hundreds of thousands, maybe more. It would have such a huge impact on our country.
2 years ago this week, Mitt Romney kind of, I guess, won a debate by lying using a technique that's called the Gish Gallop. And the Gish Gallop is when you just it's kind of like throwing tons of stuff at the wall to see what sticks, in the sense that you just say all sorts of nonsense, and it makes it impossible for your opponent to possibly debunk and respond to each piece. And you come away looking as if you actually made some pretty good points. And Mitt Romney lied 27 times in 38 minutes during a debate. And the last presidential election in totality, right? The debates, the TV ads, the financing, the general shenanigans was pretty devoid of integrity. And there'd be no reason to think that there would be a break from that during the debates. It's actually become a technique now to lie, not sparingly, but so much that your opponent really can't combat each and every lie.
It's all just lies and nonsense. And it's not like they're even lying when asked important questions. The questions they're asked usually are not that important. There's no nuance. There is no detail. And it's a total joke. Last election cycle, I did not really even watch any of the debates because they were so infuriating.
There should be several changes to the debates, except that the candidates would just never agree to them, and they hold quite a bit of power. What if we said, well, we're going to be having live fact checkers, and there will be an announcement of when a candidate said something that is simply not true, almost like a PolitiFact, instant PolitiFact. Candidates would never agree to that, of course. You should also be able to have way more back and forth between the candidates so they're able to call each other out. Typically, candidates don't want that, particularly when one is a stronger debater than the other. But in general, neither of them want that. They want to be able to practice their messaging and not have the monkey wrench of being called out on BS. There are so many changes that could be made to the debates, but the candidates would never agree to that. And you kind of need the candidates there for the debates to happen.
You do. Honestly, at this point, I think we'd be better off without the debates. They seem to do more harm than good.
But how would people then get exposure to the candidates? We know the political ads are completely biased and highly produced and nonsense. How are people to get exposure to the candidates?
That's a good question. I didn't bother trying to figure that one out. All I know is that these debates are basically a coin flip as to who's going to win, and it's just a bunch of lies and nonsense and non-important crap.
Wow, Lewis feeling very strongly against debates. Do you agree with Lewis? Do you disagree that we need debates and we need to... What are some practical changes that could be made that maybe candidates would agree to? I don't even know. 1 year ago this week, an estimated 10,000 people were sickened by salmonella-laced chicken, and the chicken was traced to Foster Farms. Foster Farms had quite the PR campaign. In fact, after we reported on it, we got an email from a Foster Farms PR person saying that we were wrong about A, B, C, D, and please to update the report. And I said, I'd be willing to update the report if you can answer these 3 or 4 specific questions, which did not make any sense in terms of their explanation. They said, we're going to talk to the management team and get you some answers. Of course, we never heard back. Thus, we never went on the air and retracted our statements since we had no confirmation that they were even false. In 1997 and in 2005, hundreds of employees at Foster Farms went on strike, accusing them of unfair labor practices. These big agriculture and big meat companies, Lewis, it seems that in general they're to be avoided if possible, but particularly in restaurants, you kind of can't, right? You're really giving up control when you go to a restaurant. You have no idea where the food came from. And many times, even the restaurant is not going to be completely sure because the people there might not be the ones who even do the ordering.
You really don't know. Unless you are eating at one of those places that uses locally sourced ingredients, these ultra high-end places who can tell you the farm where their chicken came from, or maybe even butcher the chickens themselves, you're completely in the dark.
Yeah, no question about it. And this is an issue. It continues to be an issue. And later on, actually, I think we're going to keep talking about ag-gag, the agriculture gag laws. We've talked about them recently. We're going to continue talking about them, where it's a law. It's one of the most corporatist laws that I can imagine, which is prevent journalists from being able to film what's going on at these places, even from the road. It's just sickening the amount of power that these big corporations have over government and over the legislative system. We've talked about it. We're going to continue talking about it. And we'll take a break now and be back with a lot more today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to The David Pakman Show.
Today's classic interview is with University of Massachusetts economics professor Gerald Friedman. The interview is back from April of 2012. And in this interview, Professor Friedman talks about how single payer, contrary to what you hear from many on the right and many who oppose a universal healthcare system, is actually very affordable. And this is so important to go back and revisit now, because now that Obamacare is more firmly in place, now that we're starting to see some of the positive things that it does, in spite of further locking us into the for-profit healthcare system, we need to again turn our attention to pushing for universal healthcare. I realize that it may not happen ever, and if it does, it may be a very long time. But other countries at our level of development have already figured it out, and that's what we need to be focused on. And it's important to know that it is affordable. So check out this classic interview with Professor Friedman. Universal healthcare, government healthcare, single-payer healthcare is affordable and it is doable, and Professor Friedman told us exactly how. Gerald Friedman's joining us. He's professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, my undergraduate alma mater, and he has a new piece in dollarsandcents.org which talks about what would a potential single-payer system actually look like, as far as what would it cost, where would the money come from, and would it be communist socialism like we hear so much in the mainstream corporate media? So Professor Friedman, I think a good place to start would be, before we talk about how such a system would be funded, what it would cost, which you outline in the paper, don't you?
Yeah, well, it would cost a lot less than we're spending now. That's kind of the bottom line. We're spending now $17 out of every $100 in the U.S. economy on healthcare, which, I mean, that may be fine. People may be happy spending a lot of money on healthcare. The problem is we get pretty bad, relatively bad healthcare for what we're spending. And we could probably get better healthcare for spending less money. That certainly is the experience of every other advanced economy.
Okay, now when you say we could spend less, that's $17. What potentially, where do you see it dropping to?
Well, it depends on how it's done, but we could certainly anticipate savings of $500 billion, which would get our spending down to something like 12 cents out of every dollar, $12 out of every $100. Then I would expect that some of these savings we would automatically use to fix some of the most pressing problems in the healthcare system. For example, 15% of Americans don't have health insurance, and their life expectancy is 6 to 8 years less than that of people who have health insurance. Another 10% or so of Americans don't have health insurance at some point during the year, or have really inadequate health insurance, type of health insurance that when you get sick, you find it doesn't cover very much.
Sure.
Yeah.
So as a percentage of GDP, though, for comparison, does the U.S. spend, how do other countries at the same level of development as the U.S. spend as a percentage of GDP on healthcare?
About 11%, which is really interesting because our system, we think, a lot of people talk about the U.S. healthcare system as, okay, we have a private system based on employer, health insurance linked with employment, and that's the way it's been. Actually, we've had a major change in our health system about 40 years ago. 40 years ago, most employment-based health insurance was done through Blue Cross Blue Shield, which was a community-based plan where everybody in the area would have similar coverage at similar prices. Since then, we've fragmented the system so that there are like hundreds of different plans offered by dozens of different companies. Canada, at the same time that we were moving in that direction towards a more private, competitive, for-profit system, Canada in 1971 adopted what they call Medicare, which is a universal single-payer system, single-payer for each separate province. Now, at that time, the United States and Canada were both spending about 7% of our gross domestic product on healthcare. Since then, our spending has gone up to 17%. Their spending has gone up to 10, 11%.
That's definitely, those are the numbers I think we need to be looking at, which you won't hear about when this is discussed, when the main criticism of it's too expensive. You don't hear those numbers, do you?
No. Our system is the one our for-profit system is the one that's expensive. And it does a bad job. Life expectancy has grown faster in Canada than in the United States during this time. We're spending more and more money, and every other advanced capitalist economy is having a bigger increase in life expectancy for less money.
Sure. Well, let's assume we could agree that the system would work better, which not everybody would concede to us. But for the purposes of this conversation, let's assume we can at least agree on that. Then the next obstacle people like to talk about is cost. And when you outline this, I think it's 1.35 trillion cost. You break down exactly how this would be paid for. What's the biggest component? Because people will assume, hey, my taxes on income are just going to go up, and it's class warfare, etc. How would you actually pay for this system, though?
Well, first of all, it would be paid for with taxes that for most Americans are less than they are currently spending for health care, for health insurance, or for out-of-pocket health care costs. For the 80 to 95% of Americans, they would be spending significantly less on buying health insurance through taxes than they're spending now. For the very rich, the program we outlined, which includes taxes on financial transactions.
The Tobin tax, right?
The Tobin tax, which is a good thing to do anyway. It obviously doesn't have anything directly to do with healthcare, but it is a tax that we should be imposing to discourage the type of reckless financial behavior that led to the crisis that the crisis was still in. So a Tobin tax, a tax on surtax on high incomes, a payroll tax that would replace what people are now paying, or some of what people are now paying. And these taxes together would generate the money that we need, even allowing that we'll be expanding coverage to all Americans and providing everybody with access to quality health care.
Sure, and this even takes into consideration the fact that if people had coverage that they weren't paying for each individual visit, you might see increased utilization, right? Things people put off, they would no longer put off. You're even considering that in the cost, are you not?
Yeah. One of the most shocking statistics we have now is that about 40% of people without health insurance do not fill prescriptions that are written by the doctor. They can't afford the prescription. They just don't fill it. Some doctor told them you should get this. They don't get it. 15 to 20% of people with health insurance do not fill prescriptions.
Incredible. So when we look at the bottom line, if we take into consideration the additional taxes being paid as well as the savings to people from not buying health insurance, everybody up to the top 4% of income earners, correct me if I'm not, would have a net gain in disposable income, right? The amount that they would save is going to be far outweighed by the additional taxes they would pay on healthcare, for healthcare.
The amount that they pay on taxes would be outweighed by the amount they save. Yes. Right. They would save money. And the biggest savings would go to the lowest income people. I mean, this would be a major step towards reversing the great flow of income up the ladder that we've had in the last 40 years. We've had a huge transfer of wealth and income up to the richest people. Actually, since I was just looking at these statistics, since the recession began, all of the increase in income that our country has had, the economic growth we've had with the recovery, has gone to not all, 93% has gone to the wealthiest 1%.
We're certainly familiar with those numbers. The next discussion, of course, which we don't have time for today, but we'll have you back for, is will this more likely happen under individual state single-payer systems? Will it happen under expanding Medicare, etc.? But no time for that today, unfortunately. The article is at dollarsandcents.org. We've been speaking with Gerald Friedman. He's professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Great piece and really a pleasure to speak with you. And and your cat is now joining us as well. So thanks to both of you, really.
Yes, that's pup.
All right, thanks, Professor.
Thank you very much.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We have some really great audience questions to answer this week. So we did the story a week or two ago on the bonus show about this woman who supposedly had a third breast implanted by a plastic surgeon to become unattractive to men. The story ended up being a hoax, but we talked about whether if someone did that, it would or wouldn't be mental illness or some other kind of disturbance. And Greg wrote to me and he said, it looks like the three-breast woman is a fake, but I have a separate comment about people's reaction to the story. When we're talking about decisions that people make about their own bodies, wouldn't it be nice if we could just let people do what they want without feeling the need to decide if we think they're crazy, disturbed, gross, or whatever? For me, this is a basic bedrock tenet of my liberalism. Tattoos, scarification, three breasts, a second nose, or eagle wings. Shouldn't we be living in a world where if someone decides it would be funny, cool, or whatever to do it to themselves, then everyone could simply look at them and say, I'd never do it, but if they enjoy it, good for them. Of course, it's different when social norms are coercing people to do things, for example, female genital mutilation, etc. But if it's just someone saying, hey, I have my own quirky and individual sense of artistic style, and I think it would be totally rad to have a second penis attached or whatever, why can't we just smile and enjoy the weirdness and diversity of humanity instead of saying gross or, oh my God, that person must have a mental disorder? This isn't a particular response to your show. Everyone was all over Facebook commenting about it. Lewis, what do you think about this, right? So we had this discussion about whether if the woman did have the third breast to be unattractive to men, whether it would be just a disturbance or mental illness, whether a doctor would even do that. And Greg says, why can't we just say, hey, whatever people want to do, if they're doing it to themselves, should we really care? Why can't we just say, hey, good for them? Where do you fall on this?
I don't think we should dismiss whatever would fall into this category and whatever people want to do to themselves. I think if someone wants to have their arm removed, that's a disorder, and there's a term for it, and there's something wrong with that person, and it's no reflection on their character, but that is not normal and it's not healthy. If someone wants to have a penis attached to their forehead, that's going to give me some insight into that person, and I think it would probably be someone that I would want to avoid.
Now, Lewis, let's explore that. This is getting interesting. I want to explore that a little further. So you're not saying that, because there's kind of two different issues, right? There's identifying people in this way for the purposes of discussion, so to speak. And then there is identifying people as ill or not ill mentally, and then using that designation to treat them in a different way, either from the point of view of our system, of our society, or in some other sense. So, for example, when we had homosexuality categorized as a mental illness, and then when we no longer had it categorized as a mental illness, it didn't practically change anything about homosexuality in practical terms. However, it certainly did do a lot in terms of the perception of homosexuality, how homophobic groups perceived and treated homosexuality, and in terms of what it was acceptable for the system, so to speak, to do with or to someone who has the diagnosis of homosexuality. So it is important in the sense that we have historical evidence that sometimes we do treat people differently based on whether their quirk or their difference or their characteristic is a mental illness or not in this hypothetical sense. That is a huge problem. We're talking, though, about two different things, right? We're not talking about people being treated differently. Although just because you and I aren't talking about that doesn't mean that society wouldn't treat people differently.
Society will treat you differently. That's a given. We saw that with the three breast story. And there's a fine line between mental illness and, some of the things people do to themselves. I think it's very clear that that is mental illness. In some other cases, it's not so clear.
But yeah, that's the thing. I'm worried that it's that clear of a line. I don't know if it is. I mean, and let me give you an example, okay? And I don't want this example to be taken the wrong way. Generally, it's considered as valid that you may have been born into the wrong body when it comes to gender. And thus, it's generally not considered mental illness to say, I'm going to have sexual reassignment surgery, or I'm going to use hormone or estrogen therapy, etc. What if someone said, as you talked about, Lewis, I feel that I've been born into a body that the gender is fine, but it's the wrong species, right? I was really destined to be, I was supposed to be, I feel internally that I am a horse, and I was incorrectly born into a human body. The perception would be very, very different. And how that person would be treated by society as a result of that would also be very, very different. So I think Greg is making a good point in the sense that when you do make these assessments, you change how people are treated. And sometimes it's a blurry line between these designations.
I think we can use tattoos as an example. At one point in the past, I think if you were covered in tattoos, you were probably treated the same way a person who might say that they think they are a horse might be treated now. And
even now we have a distinguishing situation with tattoos. If you have one tattoo that's hidden, the perception of that is very different than someone who shaves all of the hair on their body and tattoos every visible inch of skin, including even inside of their mouth, right? The perception of that in terms of mental illness or not is drastically different depending on your degree of how tattooed you are.
This is a realm that's always evolving, but there are always going to be people like someone who wants to get a third breast. Well, maybe that'll change too, but there are always going to be people who want to make modifications or change themselves in certain ways, who will be treated differently, looked down on, or thought of as crazy. And to be perfectly honest, a lot of them will be mentally ill or are mentally ill.
So where I come down on this is Greg makes a really good point that there is a lot to be said about not being judgmental. If people are doing things to themselves and that's what's quirky or different about them and it makes them happier, can we just not accept it? At the same time, we also have to be aware of how certain activities can, even if they are only for oneself, can be factually speaking self-destructive or otherwise negative. And that is a separate thing from the discriminatory aspect or from this kind of labeling aspect. But there are evaluations to be done. Are we or whoever is on your Facebook feed the people to be making those evaluations? Well, maybe not. And oftentimes even doctors aren't the right people to be making them because they've gotten things wrong over time as well, like homosexuality being a mental illness. But I think it's a very interesting question, and I don't think there is necessarily a right answer on this.
Maybe not, but it's certainly worth discussing, and I'm curious to hear what the audience thinks about this.
Derek wrote to me and said, why do Republicans and libertarians use the term European socialism as a slur when European social democratic countries are so successful? A very good question. We talked about Germany last week eliminating tuition fees. We talked about how in spite of the fact that Germany has essentially free college and university, as well as 85% of Germans covered by national health care, their tax rate is not really that high in the sense that the top marginal tax rate is about 45%. We have here in the U.S. a top tax rate of 39.6% plus state tax, depending on what state you live in. Germany is doing very, very well, yet we still hear that term European socialism used as a slur. We've seen Sweden bashing, Lewis. We saw it on the 700 Club. They did a very negative report about Sweden. We get emails from people whenever we talk about Sweden or Finland talking about how those commie socialists are just not living in reality. Why do you think it is that it has become a slur when those so-called European socialist nations are actually doing quite well?
I think in some ways the term has carried over the years from World War II
or the Cold War, yeah,
and Cold War era, language. So I think over here, partially because of that, it is a dirty word, and not just European socialism, but socialism. Just that word has that negative connotation for a lot of people. And over there in places like Denmark, Sweden, it's embraced and they're proud of it. And socialism is what they practice, and they should be proud of it. I mean, things are running well over there.
Unfortunately, the slur element of it blinds a lot of people and prevents them from ever truly exploring how this country might be better off if we at least revisited or explored whether the status quo is the best arrangement for things. And I think Lewis is spot on as to the reasons why we hear it. And I think that the effects are significantly negative because, I mean, look, go all the way back to the period after World War I, where the U.S. could have been on its way to national health care. And because the program, the idea sounded a little too much like what was going on in Germany, the idea was abandoned. In spite of the fact that for all of the bad things Germany was doing, it turns out that all of the other countries at our level of development have figured out that that is the best way forward. So the negative effect of the slur of the European socialism is very significant and tangible.
Yeah, and it's. I think we're slowly coming around here. It's starting to be starting to lose that negative connotation in some areas, and we had that socialist, self-proclaimed socialist in, where was it? Washington State, or was it
Seattle City Council, I believe.
Right. And so, slowly, hopefully, eventually we get rid of that and adopt some socialist policies.
Carmen also wrote in, and Carmen said, have you ever been at events where prayers are said? Have you ever been asked to say grace before a meal? How did or would you react? I think, talked on the show about how sometimes I worry if I go to certain things that I'll be asked to say grace, and what would I say? And I would probably say, I don't really do that. It would be great if someone else did it, or I'd love it if someone else did it, or something like that. We talked last week about the Pledge of Allegiance and what I would do in class during the Pledge of Allegiance when we were in elementary school. And I would kind of just stand there and mouth it silently. I wouldn't really say it. When I've gone to Catholic weddings where there's a full Catholic Mass, I obviously don't do any of the prayers. When people go down on the kneelers, I just sit there and don't move, and usually nobody cares. I usually try to sit at the back anyway. I certainly don't go up and get I don't eat any of the body of Christ or drink any of Christ's blood. So usually, Lewis, what I do in these situations is I just don't do anything.
Same here. Yeah, certainly. I've been to plenty of weddings and the big events at either synagogues or churches where I'm pretty much in the dark as to what's happening and what's being said. And a few times at dinners where there is a prayer said right before the meal. But I think at those smaller events, it was clear that I was not very religious, or, they knew who I was, so I wasn't expected to say anything or do anything. But, I just, whatever, go along with it, bow my head and
Oh, you do bow your head. See, that's interesting. We were recently at a wedding, Lewis, the wedding we were at in Massachusetts. And I was actually surprised when just before the meal part started at the reception, a guy came in and he was going to do a benediction. And I don't bow my head because I'm not praying, and I'm not being disrespectful, I feel like. I just sit there very politely. I don't say anything. I don't laugh. I don't make any faces. But I don't bow my head because I feel like that is what you do if you're praying to the God that the guy up at the front is talking about. And nobody has ever said anything to me. And as I looked around, there were people who had, they had their hands, I don't know what people even do. It's very awkward for me, but they were doing stuff that clearly I wasn't doing or even knew how to do. I don't think I'm being rude by simply sitting, right?
No, I mean, I just basically, look down at my thumbs and twiddle my thumbs. But I mean, I basically do it because I think it would be awkward if I made eye contact with anyone during whatever was being said.
Well, that's why I look into the middle distance. I don't look in a way that I could make eye contact with anyone.
Well, you have your way of avoiding it. I have mine.
Send us your thoughts on this. What do you do? What would you do? Have Lewis or I indicated anything that would be inappropriate in your mind that we've done? I think that's just how I handle things. That's how I'm comfortable. That is it for today. We will talk to you on the next program. Keep sending the audience questions. By the way, we do have a bonus show coming up right after this. davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.